for that introduction. Let me start out by showing you guys a small clip of videos that are in the archive. So most videos on average, most oral histories in the archive are on average about 2 hours long. So this is a tiny 3-minute excerpt patched together from one of the stories.
One morning we were sleeping and there was loud voices. So there I saw thousands of people surrounding the village with arms. Then my uncle came running. So he took us to the center of the village. He said go into the room and stay there, and all the village women and children were in that room. After about maybe 2-3 hours, which was like an eternity for us. Somebody banged on the door, the guy shouted that, open the door, otherwise we will fire inside and set the room in fire. So they told us to sit under a big tree and then start killing. My cousin got shot, and then my brother, he saw what was going on, so he started running. So one guy came with a spear and hit him. So my mother saw that and she ran after him. So she fell over him and they both were killed there. I was very traumatized. I was standing there not knowing what's happening. The gunman was only about 10 feet away, sort of, he shot at me a few times, every time he missed. So I started running there. One guy came with a spear. He tried to kill me. In the meantime, I bumped into the other guy. He was killing too. The other guy came to kill. He said, no, don't kill him. And the guy said, why not? And the one who was holding me, he said, no, I want to take this child with me. We were traveling and I was always wondering what's going to happen to me. And where he's taking me, he didn't explain to me anything. We walked 2 nights, day and night, to get to some village which I don't know the name now. So there he left me with a family. And then 6 months I lived with them. Because there was agreement with India and Pakistan that whoever was left in both countries, they should be recovered and brought back to the respective countries. They came and at about 9:30, 10 o'clock. My uncle's cousin who was there told me about my father's name and my uncle's names and all that. So then I was kind of satisfied that he knows the family, so he'll be okay to go with. So I got into the refugee camp, and my uncle, he came because he was 30 miles away in a town called Kasur. So he came from there every day to look for us. My uncle didn't realize what I needed. That all I needed was hugged and loved and be assured that I'm safe now. Then, when I was 12-year-old, then my life changed. I met my friend. With him, I found that I belonged to somebody. And I was not alone anymore. What my friend taught me, I forgave to the even people who killed my family. My own way of thinking is that just love everyone, hate no one. That's where I look at it.
So it wasn't totally clear from this little clip, but basically, if you didn't catch it, he was orphaned. Almost his entire village was, everybody was killed in the village, including his own family, and he watched that happen. And then eventually, for some reason, one of the gunmen took him along, and he was turned over to a family after they walked for 2 days and 2 nights, who adopted him. And so he was from a Muslim family. He was turned over to a Sikh family who converted him to Sikhism, and he, along with their children, was involved in farm labor. So it's not really clear what anyone's motives were, but we could maybe infer a few things here and there. Eventually, he got in a fight with somebody at school, and somehow they found out that he was actually kidnapped and was of a Muslim background. So the military, the Pakistani military, came to pick him up because there was some sort of agreement between the countries where they were exchanging populations of kids and women mainly that were so-called left behind, mostly confined to the Punjab area on both sides. And so that's how he was taken, and eventually he was put in a refugee camp for a couple of months in Pakistan. And someone from his extended family who had gone to the village that he was in and saw that they found everybody's body except for his, realized that he was missing and that he was probably alive. So they were looking for him, and they found him. But then he was raised as sort of like this unwanted stepchild, and he had a pretty unfortunate upbringing in that family. And when he graduated high school, he left, he went backpacking through the Middle East and ended up in England and never went back. And then eventually he ended up in the US, and now he has grandchildren, and he's doing very well economically and so on. He ended up, I think, buying a few gas stations eventually in life. So his is sort of a more positive ending later on in life, but there's a lot of people who didn't have the kind of, I don't even know if I want to call it luck, after an incident like that, after some of the incidents of partition, and didn't quite make it the way that he did. So anyway, let me go ahead and introduce you now to our work. So basically today I'm going to be talking to you about the 1947 Partition Archive. It's the first crowdsourced, crowdfunded archive, and it's sort of a new way to approach public history and gather humanities data. So my background is as a physicist, as you had mentioned, and I was able to use a lot of the techniques we use to gather data. So in my case, I was gathering data of electrons, but a lot of the same techniques could be used to gather data from a lot of people. I know that sounds very cold when we're dealing with a topic that's so emotional, but that technical side of it is what's enabled this work. So I'm not going to go into the history of partition, but I will give you 2 slides and 2 sentences. So basically, when we were towards the end of World War II, the British Empire was suffering economically, and it made economic sense for them to pull out of a lot of their colonies. And of course, in India, there was already a freedom struggle going on, which they were no longer really able to oppress at that point. And there was also a movement in India, a political movement at the time. There was a Muslim League, and there was Muslim majority areas of South Asia. I don't want to call it India yet, let's call it South Asia, where these are the Muslim majority areas, what's now Pakistan and Bangladesh. And it was eventually decided by the British that they were going to go ahead and divide the subcontinent into 2 countries. And mind you, at the time, there was over 560 kingdoms, in addition to the British kingdom within South Asia. A lot of them, as you know, had treaties and agreements with the British Empire. So a lot of those kingdoms were, many of them by force, merged into what eventually became India and Pakistan. And so what was not maybe anticipated is the huge transfer of population that was going to occur when these lines were sort of drawn, sometimes even through homes and farms, and very, very quickly. And by somebody who was not familiar with the subcontinent. And I think that was done intentionally so that he wouldn't have an emotional tie. In any case, I want you to imagine for a second what the world would be like today if we did not have the kind of documentation we have of the Holocaust in Europe, of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, of all the stories. I think there's more than 50,000 in the Shoah Foundation of Holocaust survivors. And even Hiroshima and Nagasaki, I think there's about 12,000 oral histories just from that area. So a lot of that work has enabled us to have the UNHCR, for example, comes from a lot of the work done with refugees from the Holocaust. the nuclear non-proliferation movement has a lot to do with its origins from the human accounts of what happened during Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and so on and so forth, our understanding of dictators, and we can prevent a lot of tragedies because of what we've gained from the knowledge of these events. However, you have partition, where you had about 14 to 15 million refugees between 1946 and 1948. That's massive. And if you go into the 1950s, that number is between 20 and 25 million by some estimates. And that's about 1%, almost 1% of the world's population at that time. So if you extrapolate to today, that would be 70 million people becoming refugees because of this line that was drawn. So that's massive. And if you look at the whole subcontinent being impacted, because as it turns out, it wasn't just those areas that were demarked that I showed you. In fact, people moved all over the subcontinent because of partition. So if you look at those numbers, it's about 14% of the world's population that was directly impacted by partition. That's huge. Yet, we have not done the work necessary to understand its impacts. And it continues to impact us all over the world today in many subtle ways that we haven't really realized, and we're just starting to understand. So here's just a photo of some of the thousands of, maybe hundreds of trains with, packed with refugees that were going to both sides of the border, or crossing both sides of the border. And many of these trains actually arrived on one side or the other completely massacred. So sometimes you hear of stories of people who survived because they hid under corpses, and they were maybe like the sole survivor in the train. So just to give you my background, as you know, professionally, I have no background in partition studies or the humanities. I come from the sciences. However, my upbringing, I was born in Delhi, and my family is from the Punjab region, really close to the border with Pakistan. I come from a military family, so I grew up kind of all over the place, but all of my summers were spent close to the border, where we used to go to what's now the Wagah border. It was not elaborate at the time. They did not have ceremonies, but we used to go there to wave at the Pakistani guards and to see where we came from. So we knew we had come from the other side of the border, and I was very well aware of that division since I was very young. And I was also aware of the lack of historical preservation, because in Punjab, on my family's farm and other farms, we used to find ancient coins and really interesting artifacts that were melted, and there was like no government support or any kind of effort to preserve these incredible things that were being found. And so I always wanted to change that. I was going to do something to change that fact. So that's my connection to partition. Fast forward to 2008, I was finishing up my PhD in Japan, and I ended up going to Hiroshima. That's the Peace Memorial. And there, I was very deeply moved by the oral histories, because I had read books on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and watched films, but I felt the oral histories gave it a legitimacy that no other form of evidence could, because as humans, we relate better to other humans, and you could really internalize what it must have felt like to have lived through that. And I feel like that's what inspired more research, was the oral histories and the initial knowledge and information that you get from people's stories inspires you to go out and dig further. Did they really see that? Was that the truth? And so on. And in that moment, I realized that this thing I had been thinking about with partition and historical documentation in South Asia, maybe that was the answer. Maybe it was oral history. So I came back to the US, started searching on Google, could not find anything, no source of oral histories on partition. I now know that there was a book by Butalia, which I was not aware of at the time, but there was no public archive where you could watch people. There was no video-based archive of oral histories. And I had no intention of creating one. I just kind of on my own started recording people's stories back in villages in Punjab that same year, 2008, 2009. And then my grandmother's brother, who was the last person in my family of that generation, he was in his 90s, I was going to record his story, but he passed away before that happened. And in that instant, I was like, oh wow, these people are not going to be here for long, and there's no one in my family left to tell these stories, but there's still thousands of people from other people's families that can tell these stories. And I was by then at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab and UC Berkeley doing my postdoc. And I was like, okay, I have to do this, even if I'm really busy with my postdoc. And I didn't know anyone because I just moved to California, so I started talking to students and student clubs on campus, and started going to mosques and temples in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, and telling them about this work. And tons of elders started lining up to tell their stories. And I realized that there was a need, there was no way I could do this by myself. And that's how this whole concept developed. So that was the problem was that people who remembered partition were not just in the Bay Area, they were all over the world. They were in their 80s, 90s, over 100. There was an urgency, we needed to do this now. And we didn't have any money. How were we going to reach these people all over the world with hardly any resources and very quickly? That's what gave rise to the idea of crowdsourcing. It's a concept I was really familiar with in the world of physics because it had been used for protein folding, for solving those problems. And so, how about applying it to this problem? So in 2009, crowdsourcing has become really popular since 2009 for a lot of different applications, but in 2009 it was still sort of a new concept becoming popular. So what we did is we started teaching people everywhere how to record stories. I'll go into this slide in a second. And then they would go out into their communities, record these stories, and submit them through an online portal. And these were huge video files, so how do we work that out? Luckily, we were in Silicon Valley. We had a startup that deals with really large file transfers, even from places where they have bad internet connections, like in India and Pakistan. So they came and they do our entire backend to this day. And Amazon came in and they started helping us pro bono. So that was one of the very lucky things of being in Silicon Valley. And we were able to get the tech support needed to do this without having the millions of dollars needed to develop these systems. That's just a slide showing the Scientific American article on using crowdsourcing for protein folding. And this, my hippie slide, this photo, it's called Building a Rainbow. And I was always very inspired by it. I found this at a thrift shop in New York when I was 15. And I always thought this idea of a lot of people coming together to build something bigger than themselves was very cool, and it was still in my mind when we were trying to figure out what to do to preserve these oral histories. So that's just an overview of our mission. I'm going to go past really quickly. Now, partitions have affected other parts of the world. We know about Bosnia, Rwanda, Korea, Israel, Palestine, even Iraq. They were talking about that in more recent times. I know that the circumstances are slightly different for each case, but oftentimes the results have been similar, like in Rwanda. We already talked about the lack of historical preservation. It happens, but just not at the scale that you see in Europe and other places in South Asia. So our solution of crowdsourcing enabled us to do this quickly, to do this very cheaply, relatively cheaply, rather than sending people out to all these places. It enabled us to have global reach, so we were able to get stories from 12 countries. And we were able to engage the public in documenting history in a way that hadn't really been done before at this scale. So people now were going out into their communities, learning this knowledge firsthand, and suddenly the families were realizing how important their grandparents' stories were, which they maybe hadn't given as much attention to. And over time, over the last decade since we've been doing this work, it has popularized this concept of oral histories and documenting partition so much that it's all over the media in India today. And we can even use data from Google to see that change, which actually I don't have that analysis for you today because we're still working on it. Just a photo of me when we first started doing the work. This is me in Amritsar in India. One of the things we discovered while going around in the shops was some of these shops were over 300 years old. They were super, super old, been there forever. And people had seen all sorts of migrations and stories from their ancestors also. So that's just a photo of me recording stories on this. In the early days, to spread the word, we used social media and we tried to go to every single event we possibly could. South Asian, American events in the Bay Area. And the people who were doing this were not of South Asian origin only. There were people from every background. Anyone who wanted to participate in documenting this chapter in our history. So I already talked about how it works. We train people, they go out in their community, record stories, So any one of you could do this, and then you upload the stories. It's a very deeply engaging experience, and it's kind of like a transformative experience. I highly recommend it, even if not for partition, for maybe your own family's history. So stories from all over the world go into a cloud which is managed from Berkeley, though we do have an office now in Delhi as well. So we have over 5,300 oral histories in the archive, making it the largest oral history archive out of South Asia, and maybe the largest crowdsourced archive. So over 6,000 hours of video. Over 550 people have contributed to building the archive from 12 different countries, and from more than 400 different cities and villages. And the stories, actually now we're up to 24 languages, and some languages that are very endangered as well, like Dorwali, which I'd never even heard of until it appeared in the archive. And of course, a lot of people sharing these stories on social media has created a change in the public mentality and acceptance of partition history, which when we first started, there was a lot of resistance. People were very afraid to share their stories. They'd be like, are you from the government? Why do you want to know? But now it's almost become like a thing. Like a lot of other little projects have popped up all over South Asia for recording these stories, which I think is great and needs to be done. So where do these stories go? One place they go to is on our website. Right now we don't have the videos up because of bandwidth issues that we're trying to solve, but we do have some basic information. You can see a map on our site. You can see all the places the stories were recorded. You can click on a city, see the different stories from that city. If you click on a person, you can see, well, we can't see the whole thing here, but a small biographical background and a short clip of their video if you have it up. The stories are also going into Stanford University's library's digital repository, and they're going to be streamed, the complete videos are going to be streamed via the digital repository at Stanford. And we're only able to make a small portion of the collection public this way, because as you can imagine, some of the stories are very delicate. They might be naming people, they might be confessing to killings, which does happen. They might be saying things that will endanger their family or other people. So those stories are not public, but at our partner libraries, those stories will become available through streaming from the Stanford Library. And we're hoping that your library will be one of the libraries that the stories will become available at. So right now we do have libraries in India and Pakistan that have signed on, and that portion of the work is being funded by Tata Trust in India. So the archive is already in use. There's a number of museums that have started using stories from the archive to develop exhibits. There's Canadian Museum of Human Rights. There's a museum in India, the Anandpur Sahib Museum, I forget what it's actually called. And there's a number of exhibits that have used stories from the archive. There's a number of Bollywood films that have used stories from the archive. Has anyone seen Pag Milk Pag? It's about the Olympic athlete. Okay, one person. It's about the Olympic athlete who became big. His running career actually started during partition when he was running from the mobs. But anyway, they used the archive for reference. And there's new BBC documentaries that came out last year on partition. All of them reference the archive. So it's already becoming a resource that's valuable in that way. Just a few learnings. So this is last week. Last week I was in the Sundarbans. So I unfortunately don't have a map up here, but for those of you guys who can envision the map of South Asia, there's, so this is India, there's Bangladesh towards the right, and in the Bay of Bengal, there's this region which consists of mangrove forests that easily get flooded when there's cyclones and hurricanes. So in that area, it's traditionally been inhabited mostly by tribal people who've been native to that region, and they kind of know how to adapt to those constantly changing weather patterns, and they know how to live with the man-eating tiger, which is prevalent in that area. Still to this day, there's crocodiles, there's pythons. It's a very sort of volatile environment in that way. However, at the time of partition, thousands of people were settled there. They were given land grants in this marshy area that's not really habitable, except for the tribal people who adapted to it over a very long time. And so there's been a lot of issues with that because these people haven't been able to adapt so well, to the tiger attacks and to all of the, I guess, very sort of volatile environmental aspects of the area. So here we interviewed, so we have team members out there. I was just visiting them. So Amrita Dasgupta on our team was interviewing this 108-year-old man who remembers the time when Tagore and a man named Hamilton were trying to create settlements in this area in the 1930s. And then he also remembers the influx of refugees that came in because of that promise from the 1930s of this area, the belief that this area could be habitable. And interestingly, the refugees who were settled here, it was a very class-related thing because they tended to be mostly from, quote unquote, the lower class, the lower castes. And the upper castes were given land in more farmable areas and in big cities like Calcutta. But a lot of people who were given land here, that's the only land they were given, and there's been a lot of uprisings and whatnot because of that. So it's still politically active today because of this settlement. This particular man, just to go into his story, he was attacked by tigers a few times. A lot of the women in this area do not have husbands because they lose their husbands when they go out fishing to tiger attacks, but he was one of the few survivors, and I guess he lived into over 100. Very interesting way that people have adapted to this land, which I don't have time to go into, but I wanted to show you a quick video from this interview. It's literally a minute, but it just gives you an idea of the kind of work that's being done. That's not it. I'm not sure if this is the right project, or this is the right video file. I have a suspicion it might not be. No, this is not. I apologize, I don't have that video with me on this computer. So never mind, you're going to miss the video of the 108-year-old man. But in any case, moving along. So just to give you some more glimpses at the archive. Oh, that's just last week in the Sundarbans. So these are some of the tiger widows. Unfortunately, they're called tiger widows. These are people who, so when we were walking into the open forest, literally as people saw us walk by their houses, they would come out because they believed that you should not be walking alone in the Sundarbans, and there's power in numbers. They would just drop whatever they're doing and come and join us. So I thought that was really fascinating. So this man was 107 when we interviewed him several years ago. He was a tailor before partition. He was a tailor to the day he died. But he brought to our attention some really interesting facts. For example, I always thought chai was a staple South Asian drink, but it turns out that it was made popular, according to him, by the East India Company, and he claimed that he still to this day boycotts tea and chai, but he claimed at the time that the East India Company was going around people's houses and spiking their milk with chai to get people addicted to tea. So just some really interesting things that will get you thinking and get you to go out and do more research to verify if it's true and so on. And there's a lot of musical Quranas that were disrupted. So musical traditions that were carried on in families from one generation to the next. So a lot of that was disrupted at the time of partition. He was just a family that we were interviewing in Uttar Pradesh. So a lot of interesting stories have also come in from the northwest frontier region and the border with Afghanistan, areas we didn't really think were affected by partition, but it turns out were. So this is the language I was talking to you about, Torvali. So there's an area there where there's only 3,000 speakers left in the Swat region, and we're getting some stories in that language. So even New York City. So here is a man of Jewish descent, and they were living in a very ancient Jewish community in India. They were living in Karachi and eventually migrated to Bombay at the time of partition in India, and then eventually to Israel. So that was really interesting. There was a lot of recruitment of young Jewish boys in India at the time of the creation of Israel, which is just a year after partition in 48. So he was part of that. So he was recruited by the Builders movement, and he went over to Israel, lived in a kibbutz, and then eventually made it over to New York City, where he lives today. And that's Erin Riggs on our team interviewing him. In fact, she's now pursuing her PhD on a topic that she came up with while she was volunteering with the archive. Princely states, really fascinating histories that come out of there that are not known in the mainstream, and it really brings out the importance of the princely states culturally in South Asia, something that we've sort of brushed under the rug in modern times. We also get really interesting possible insights into the origin of the violence. We learn over and over again most people who were going out attacking, so we've interviewed attackers and victims. Both of them claimed that they were not attacking somebody that they knew. They were always going to attack places where they did not know anybody. And the attacks were usually economically driven. They were promised that they were going to get a lot of loot, a lot of interesting things, and also to kidnap women, unfortunately. It seems a polarization, there's a lot of political polarization that was driving these mobs. So it was coming from the top down, and local leaders were then trying to incite mobs to remove, say, certain groups from their area to make room for refugees that were coming in from the other side, and so on. And also, a lot of the violence came to an abrupt end when military and police from other regions came in. Because in Punjab and Bengal, the military and the police were being divided between the two countries. So people no longer knew who they were defending, and that made the violence go out of control. So it was sort of a breakdown of civil society in a way, and I think I could see this happening anywhere. Like, even here in any city in the U.S., if you take away the police, what would happen? Maybe in a day or two it would be fine, but over time it would happen. So if we ask ourselves that question and do like a mental experiment, we could kind of see how the violence went out of control during partition. Some interventions, like I said, the stories remain in the family, they start to spread in the community, and suddenly now, like a decade later, it's okay to talk about partition very openly. And people who witness partition are very eager to tell their stories. It's a very different story than we first started. There's a lot of cross-border communication that our work has enabled. Here's just some examples that we don't have time to read. But it's really fascinating because old friends and family have found each other through our Facebook page, and that's extremely rewarding when that happens. And also another interesting phenomenon that happens is young people who live in areas that a lot of these partition witnesses fled from, when we post their stories online, they volunteer to go take pictures of their old homes and submit them. So that's something that social media is enabling, because the wall between India and Pakistan is pretty impenetrable. It's very, very solid. But social media kind of lets you get past that. So as I mentioned, we're sort of normalizing having people's memory of partition in mass media and just like in everyday life. This work has inspired a number of other works that have popped up in the last year or two. There's Harvard South Asia Institute has started recording oral histories, although we've been in communication with them the whole time we've done our work. There's a partition museum now in Amritsar that just opened up last year. And there's a number of other social media pages that are starting to document oral histories in their region. They're not maybe as official and as rigorously done, but it's kind of cool to see little community efforts pop up everywhere. This is just a list of a lot of some of the films and plays that this work has inspired. It doesn't include any of the PhD theses or academic work. So this resource is built for you, and if you would like, you can also record a story and help build this resource. So that's it for my talk.
Thank you.